Making, my real job is not doing tours. You will establish that fairly rapidly. I'm a medic at the Western General Hospital, and Keir Liddell is...
Well, I'm Keir Liddell, yes.
Yes, sorry.
I am the scientist in this equation. You can quibble with me later about whether or not psychology is a science, or not. And I am doing the science portion of the tour.
And welcome to Skeptics on the Fringe. We're doing free events pretty much every night during the Fringe, mostly at 8:30 at the Banshee Labyrinth, but with special events at the Jam House, which are on
Queen Street,
which is on Queen Street, which is this Tuesday and the one after. Tonight we've got doing Scientologists. We're going to go on a quick walk around Edinburgh, seeing the medical history of Edinburgh and the history of science in Edinburgh. Hopefully it'll be interesting, and let's start up here at the statue.
We started appropriately for Skeptics at the statue of David Hume. David Hume, a famous philosopher in the Scottish Enlightenment, and considered the founder and father of many things, including cognitive science, and indeed modern skepticism. Now, in his time, he was an atheist, a rationalist and a philosopher. He was also a white supremacist, but we might let him off with that given the times in which he lived and was raised. But you may notice, this gentleman here being a perfect example, that people do rub his toe. And now this is supposed to be for good luck. It's a relatively new superstition because despite the Greco-Roman stylings of the statue, it was only erected in 1997. But since then, philosophy students started rubbing his toe before exams, believing it would give them good luck. Or perhaps just as a student joke. Now, tourists, philosophy students and all sorts will walk past and rub his toe. Last year, Edinburgh Skeptics, as part of a scientific experiment or promotional stunt, decided to test whether or not rubbing David Hume's toe was lucky. So we stood here in lab coats, mainly in the pouring rain, with clipboards and a large coin. And what we asked people to do was to rub David Hume's toe and to guess the outcome of a coin toss. And we also had a control group who weren't allowed to touch David Hume in any way, shape or form, and then to guess the outcome of a coin toss. And we discovered that it is in fact unlucky to rub David Hume's toe if you want to predict the outcome of a coin toss. Coin toss.
Your sample's too big, you're prone to getting a furious result.
Yes.
We're now going over to Parliament Square, where there's supposed to be some ghosts, and if you just follow us, I'll do my tour guide. Is there anyone at...
Good. Last year there were people juggling chainsaws over there, which was very fun to try and talk over. Stephen, would you like to come and tell the audience about Fringe?
We are now in Parliament Square, which is nowhere near the Scottish Parliament, but we just skim over that. If you do come on the ghost tours, they will inform you there are often ghosts seen here because it was a plague pit. Well, firstly, ghosts don't exist, so sorry to ruin the truth about ghost tour. Secondly, it wasn't a plague pit. The plague did hit Edinburgh on a regular basis from 1349 to 1650, and there were plague pits. They just weren't in the middle of the city because that would have been ridiculous. When the plague did hit, people with the plague were evacuated to huts either on Bruntsfield Links or on Holyrood Park. In the later stages, they were actually sent to Inchiquel Island to die. But what they never ever happened was they were never walled into a street, despite what popular tourist attractions may tell you, who have lawyers. We wouldn't possibly insinuate they're just lying. Anyway, they're lying. Someone is lying. They're not saying who. The plague, as I'm sure you know, is a deadly disease. It's now depressingly cured by 2 antibiotics. It's rather takes 12 hours diagnosing it. Not that you ever do. But the first thing you would have noticed in the 16th century is that you would get a swelling under your armpit. It would be quite quiet and you might not notice it. The Latin for owl is bubo, so this is called a bubo, despite bearing no resemblance to an owl. It would then explode and you would get feverish and you would die quite shortly afterwards. It was highly contagious and people did die quite rapidly. So it wasn't really passed from person to person. It was mainly spread by fleas because every house would have its own rat colony. The fleas of the rats would get the plague, the rats would die, and then they would bite people. Lovely. I like the miming video.
I was just sort of jiggling from side to side.
Oh, right.
This is not a symptom of plague, this is more St. Vitus dance.
Yeah.
That's it. We're also in the vicinity of the back of the National Library of Scotland, which contains a copy of every book published in Scotland from some date way back in history to the modern day. So it includes all the works of the likes of Sir Walter Scott, Ian Rankin, and even a copy of The Hungry Caterpillar, or The Very Hungry Caterpillar, sorry. But there is one little known book that caused a bit of a scandal that is also held within these walls. It was a book written by Eustace Cheshire, who was an Edinburgh psychiatrist, and he was charged for obscenity for the publication of this book. The title of the book, these were obviously gentler times, is Love Without Fear, How to Achieve Sex Happiness in Marriage. Now, the book caused quite a great deal of controversy, but did manage to sell over 5,000 copies before it was banned. Eustace, rather than deciding to pay the fine for obscenity or the jail time, decided he wanted to be tried by jury for the publication of this book. And the jury proved to be more enlightened than the prudes who wanted it banned, and he was allowed to continue to practice. And the fame he gathered from this trial led to him to becoming one of the world's first sexperts, appearing on radio and television to discuss relationship and marital problems.
It's interesting that actually ignorance about how you have sex was actually a common problem, really, certainly at the turn of the century in the 1930s, and was listed in many medical textbooks as a cause for infertility. And the standard investigation of infertility, really up until about 20 years ago, was an investigation to determine that the couple were actually having sex in the correct way. There was a test called the postcoital test, which was taking a swab of sperm from the vagina immediately after sex, which was partly to establish that it was actually getting in the right place. And my grandfather was a pharmacist for many years, but would have been 97 now, and he very regularly would have had honeymooning couples trying to buy contraception, and quite often it would come to light that they actually had no idea how to consummate the marriage because
there was an absence of pornography.
There was an absence of pornography.
And many other sex.
There was pornography, it just wasn't quite as freely available, and it was mainly ladies just pretending to be artist models or play volleyball. Moving on rapidly from pornography, we're just going to head down this way, down one of the old wines. We'll get more a sense of the Edinburgh Old Town.
Just over there, past the Fringe hubbub, you can see that rather grand building there, which constitutes the City Chambers of Edinburgh. Below that, when they built it, there were lots of closes, lots of streets, and rather than demolishing all these and build proper foundations, the Council of Edinburgh at the time, being traditionally Scottish and possibly penny pinching, decided it would be a good idea just to build on top of these, which has given rise to the legends of a certain holiday destination and ghost stories about plague, claiming that the street was walled off due to plague. Now, this is untrue, but what is true, and is of interest perhaps to engineers and plumbers, is that Mary King's Close was the first place in Edinburgh where there was a flushing toilet. It was owned by a carpenter who lived at the end of the close, and he was so proud of it at the time, as it was a new device, a new technology, very posh. He would keep the door open so people could observe his toilet, which he called the Thunderbox, due to the noise it made when he flushed. We'll now continue down the close, and you'll get a flavour of what Edinburgh was like when it was towering above us and made of wood.
We are now in one of the many wines that come down off the Royal Mile, and until the new town was built, almost everyone in Edinburgh would live in one of the buildings here. Most areas of the city you'd have the rich and the poor living separately. In Edinburgh they all lived in the same buildings but were differentiated by height. Poor people would live at the lower floors and the rich people would live on the upper floors, which is fascinating because now there are still buildings where there's 8 floors and no lift, and the properties on the top are considerably cheaper than the ones on the bottom. And what these buildings did have is they had many. I have no idea. They had many. You can see they're incredibly tall, but they had. Before the new town, they would have had wooden stories on top of them, and they got up to as many as 14 stories. There was no such thing as planning permission. A good number of them collapsed and killed people. They did set on fire. They were dangerous, and the other reason they were dangerous is they didn't have plumbing at all. You had to fetch water from a standpipe and just keep it in your house. You then had to, when you had foul water, you would simply open the window and throw it out. The rule was that you weren't allowed to throw sewage out your window until the bell of St Giles had sounded 10 p.m, and then you would open the window and shout Gardaloo, which meant something in French.
Mind the water.
Mind the water.
Yeah, exactly. I'm French.
You're French. And people underneath would know, hopefully, to get out the way.
We don't do that anymore.
We don't do that anymore in Edinburgh either, fortunately. And unless you were not known to the city and you didn't know what Gardaloo meant, when you might look up and discover a whole new meaning for the term having a night that's getting shit-faced. The main thing that's surprising about Edinburgh is it didn't actually get cholera until the 18th century, but when it did, obviously there was an epidemic and lots of people died. They didn't have sewers at all underground until the building of the new town. They would just simply have water going down the streets in the wines that were called foul burns and open sewers. And you wonder if a town that's discovered quite so much medical history is because when you get disease you just attract doctors, or whether the doctors actually cause disease. But I suspect this many ill people would have just given them plenty to study.
Where did the first toilet go to?
I don't know where the first toilet went to, because it must have been maybe into the open sewer. Because there was a proposal to build, when the Royal College of Physicians said that this huge cholera outbreak, people are dying, you need to do something about the sewers. They said, okay, we'll build more open sewers, which were just gullies down the middle of the streets for sewage to go down. And it didn't work very well. But the first toilet may have gone into an open sewer. So we'll go on down to the... Will you just follow me? The next bit in the tour I'm waiting for Keir to do.
Oh.
Hello.
Now, as will become apparent during various points of this tour, we've had to be quite opportunist with our route for science landmarks. The scientists who lived in Edinburgh were spread far and wide around the university and around the new town. But can anyone hazard a guess as to why we've chosen this particular landmark?
Telephones.
Yes, it is. A telephone exchange would not be possible without the invention of telephone, patented by Alexander Graham Bell. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, as any Scotsman will say, dismissing any arguments that he stole the design from someone else, and indeed then trying to claim that he only stole bits from other people's design after he held the patent. And no Scotsman will hold any other argument to be true on this fact. He started his invention career in Edinburgh at the age of 12, where he invented a device using nails and paddles for the dehusking of crops. Now, this became quite a popular device and went into common usage for many years before it was superseded by better agricultural technology. Alexander Graham Bell was famously modest about the success he expected of the telephone. He believed that at one point in the future every town in America would have one. Famously, he found the infernal bleeping and ringing of his device, of people trying to get hold of him at all times, to be very irritating, as anyone with a mobile phone and a conscientious parent may be familiar with. He would never have one in his study, as he saw it as a distraction from his real research. He was very interested in looking into research in hearing and speech, because his wife was deaf. As a result of this, he also held some interesting views about eugenics and the breeding of the congenital deaf. But as with David Hume and his views on white supremacy, we may charitably view these as a product of the time and place in which he lived. Stephen?
Yes, we are... The next opportunist moment I've taken is, this is just at the bottom of the University of Edinburgh Hall of Residence, which is a new development, because when the University of Edinburgh was established, in my little book of dates, was 1530 something. I can't remember the date because I've got them all down. it was interesting in two levels. It was the fourth university in the UK, and it was the first one that wasn't established by the church. It was established by the town council. And the town council established a university, and they were basically a board that would set examinations, but students didn't have any colleges. There was no provision for anywhere for the students to live, and there was actually very little provision for teaching. It was more like a modern exam board. There was a number of people called regents who had established themselves as independent tutors, and a popular one, and you would just turn up at the age of about 14 or 15, pay your money to the regent of your choice, pick a popular one, and then go for your exam at the end. So the popular ones were very crowded, the poor ones didn't do that well, so it's quite different from other student feedback today, when you basically are taught by whoever couldn't get out of it. If your department's a bit more research focused. The medical school was one of the oldest departments at the University of Edinburgh, and it was first based on a model from the University of Leiden, which was one of the first modern medical schools where they started teaching anatomy, which becomes relevant later when I start talking about body stretching. One of the first chairs of medicine was from Leiden. He was Professor Boerhaave, and he is famous for Boerhaave syndrome, which is he observed that drunk sailors would occasionally vomit and then die suddenly. When he did post-mortem, he would find they had a ruptured esophagus, and it's still a condition we diagnose today as Boerhaave syndrome. It was first diagnosed on a Dutch admiral. Very tangentially related, I think it's interesting. And we are now heading down here and up a flight of stairs.
And here is number 2 in a series of spurious links to science and local Edinburgh landmarks. As we're about to ascend these steps to Chalmers Street, it occurs to me that the issues of force and mass come to mind, which are of course related to physics, which allows me to talk about perhaps one of Scotland's greatest scientists, James Clerk Maxwell, who unified the theories of magnetism and optics, and was a great influence on physics. Indeed, he was such an influence to Albert Einstein that Einstein kept a picture of Maxwell above his desk as a source of inspiration. The work of Maxwell has allowed many generations of physicists to build on this, to come up with new theories and develop new experiments and new tests. One of the most famous physics experiments at the moment is undoubtedly the large, I'll say this very carefully, Hadron Collider in Switzerland. Now this experiment is run because a very slightly reclusive Edinburgh resident, Peter Higgs, came up with the theory to explain the missing mass that we observe in the world. He proposed that there was a Higgs field, and he came up with this idea whilst walking in the Scottish Highlands and observing the mist in one of the glens. And he hypothesised that there was this field which went through all things and applied the mass that was missing. He tried to publish a paper on this, but as he didn't have a particle to explain what the field was made of, it didn't initially gather much interest. So he went away, had a think, and decided, rather sensibly, because he wanted to publish this idea, that the Higgs field would be made up of particles, which he called the Higgs boson. And very excitingly, the LHC now believes they've found a particle that behaves how they expect a Higgs to behave, is at the energy level they expect the Higgs to be found at, looks like a Higgs, sounds like a Higgs, quarks like a Higgs, and hopefully will be a Higgs. Hopefully. So, as we climb to the top, we can hopefully appreciate how Peter Higgs helps us appreciate the energy and the force that it takes to get our mass up there to Chalmers Street, where we will be at the Museum of Scotland.
And whilst we're tangentially on the subject of magnetism, not every doctor who graduated from Edinburgh University did eminent works. There was one who actually never graduated, called James Graham, who was again in the 18th century, and instead of practicing as a doctor, he travelled to America and learnt about the new discovery of electricity and magnetism, specifically wondering how he could use it to attract money into his wallet from other people's. He established a house of magnetism in London, employed a number of women as the goddesses, and they would welcome, including Emma Hamilton, who then became Lady Hamilton and had an affair with Lord Nelson. And if you were to visit the House of Magnetism, you could have a choice to bathe in a bath of electrified water, which would apparently cure all sorts of ills, like being alive, presumably, but it didn't kill that many people because he carried on.
People who are dead are really ill again.
Yeah, no,
it's true.
I've had a healer say to me that when one of her patients, I had a friend whose brother was on intensive care because her mother decided to take him to a healer instead of a doctor for his severe asthma. And when he got off intensive care, her mother took him back to a healer, and they said, well, I always think of healing as being relieving suffering, and if he died he wouldn't be suffering from asthma anymore. And I really think her mother did really well not to punch the woman. Anyway, the other thing you could do in James Graham's House of Healing was lie on a celestial bed as a cure for infertility because it's surrounded by magnets. But what we're really talking about here is body snatching, because you can't actually have a medical tour of Edinburgh without mentioning body snatching, because we have the old Anatomy Lecture Theatre in this building there, and you would have had body. Until the 15th century, anatomy was not really studied. Knowledge of medicine, knowledge of science, knowledge of what was in the human body, mainly came from the Roman physician Galen, who appeared to have dissected some humans, but a lot of animals 1,500 years ago. People thought that at the back of the brain there was a network of blood vessels called the rete mirabilis that actually never only exists in dogs. People thought that the wombs, human wombs which only exist in sheep and cows, and that human wombs had cotyledons which exist in dogs. It's only with the Renaissance that the concept of dissecting bodies to find out actually what's in there has come about, and since then there's been huge advances in medicine and surgery. But unfortunately, to do that you need bodies, and the good people of Edinburgh do not want their relatives dissected, and this caused problems. Initially the city of Edinburgh provided one body of an executed criminal a year, which doesn't get you very far when you've got hundreds of medical students. The Royal College of Surgeons would use it, and because they were in a collegiate system, the professors were competing with each other. The more students you got, the more you earned, and students would come to the university to take their exams, but they would also attend for lectures at extramural schools, and they would be in competition. So because there was the Royal College of Surgeons, and you would also study for your surgeon's exams, anyone could turn up at these schools, pay a fee and learn anatomy. People who wanted to study art and paint better nude would be interested in learning anatomy. And there came a time when there was a number of schools in competition that were needing around 90 bodies a year, and that was just not being provided to executed criminals, because even though the city was pretty good at executing people, there wasn't that many. There was an illicit trade going on where they were smuggled up from London, from the Porter at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital, which was then just Guy's Hospital, St Thomas hadn't merged with it, would be known to put a body on the stagecoach or on the train when that was invented for a bribe.
Rumour has it the bodies could smell pretty much like a comedian who's just done 3 weeks at the Fringe and gone back to London.
And like them they would have died. We can try jokes, but mainly we can tell you about the books we've read about this. Then they got the resurrection men. You could make good money selling a body to the medical school or to the anatomy school. You could make as much as £10, which is a lot of money in those days, and way over the average wage. You would get together a group of your friends and you would find a graveyard where there had recently been a burial. You would lay a sheet out on the ground so as not to disturb the turf, and you would dig a small hole, apparently about that big, just over the head, with wooden tools, not metal ones, so as not to make too much noise. When you got down to the coffin, one would attach a rope with iron hooks on it to the lid of the coffin, pull back, crack the wood, which was the most noisy bit, and be able to drag the body out and bundle it off to a school of anatomy in a sack. So there was an illicit trade in bodies, which meant anyone been to the grass market, apart from people living?
Yeah.
At the far end of the grass market there is Westport. At Westport there was a lodging house. Opposite Westport there is a strip dancing club called Burke and Hare. The lodging house was owned by Burke's mistress, and when one of her tenants died owing them £4, they thought we might as well get this money back, we'll just sell his body to the medical school, and they got £10. Then they realised there was an easy way of getting bodies than doing all this digging up business, which was to get your tenants drunk and just strangle them. The first victim was Joseph the Miller, who was a country person who was a miller by trade, who had come to Edinburgh to look for work. It was easy to get people like that who didn't know many people in Edinburgh drunk and quietly bump them off. And they would often and they would often stay in lodging houses. And they would do this probably about 6 or 7 times before they became to be any suspicion. Suspicion was raised by the medical students the first time when the body of a prostitute called Mary Buchanan was presented. And despite the fine upstanding young men who were studying medicine claiming to have no knowledge of prostitutes, quite a lot of them recognised her, and she was quite well known. They also managed to bump off a lad who was well known for doing errands around Edinburgh called who was known as Daft Jamie, that was recognised. But their downfall only came about when 2 lodgers in the lodging house were inspecting the room they'd just been given and found the body under the bed. They were called Mr. and Mrs. Gray, in fact. They were quite alarmed by this fact and immediately went to search for the local police. And when they returned, the body was gone, and the police went to search for it and found it on having been sold to the medical school with the story that they died naturally. But there was still no proof. There's still not thought to be enough proof to bring a conviction until one of them, who I believe was Berg, but my mind has actually gone blank, decided to turn king's witness and betray Hare, and he told them... The other way round, thank you. Hare betrayed Berg and turned king's witness and was let off in exchange for dobbing his friend in, which was nice. He was executed on the Lawn Market, which was roughly where we started off, and he was dissected, and I believe his skeleton is on display at the Royal College of Surgeons.
It's on display at the old anatomy museum, which is roughly in that direction, although a book made of his skin is on display in the Edinburgh Police Museum on the Royal Mile.
And there's a mask of the one when he was alive in the Royal College. Anyway, it's quite gory. However, there was actually, because of the boom in anatomy, we did discover a huge amount and save lots of lives and just bumped off a few in order to view it. So we're now going...
that is on display in public. It's not the body of a human, it is the body of a sheep. It is the body of Dolly the sheep, the world's first cloned mammal. She was cloned by scientists at the Roslin Institute, which exists to the south of Edinburgh. If you keep going that way, eventually you can't miss it. I've never actually seen it, but I assume it's there somewhere. And she lived from 1996 to 2004, when she died on Valentine's Day. The reason she was called Dolly is because the scientists cloned her from a mammary gland cell, the adult somatic mammary gland cell of a fully grown adult sheep. And the scientists in charge thought, who's an example of mammary glands that would be appropriate to name a sheep after? And they went with Dolly Parton, famed for her singing voice and other assets. The Roslin Institute no longer clones animals. It now does more research in the area of transgenic animals, which is taking DNA codes from one animal, putting it in another, or from other sources. One of the experiments they've recently been performing is to make a breed of chickens that is immune to bird flu. And other projects they are planning, and to hope get through ethics and hope to do, are to make a hardier form of European pig, so they can more easily be reared in harsher environments closer to the equator, where it's warmer and there's less food for them, to hopefully alleviate feeding crises in famine areas.
They also have a very good veterinary practice, and I took my cat there and it was dying. They didn't clone it, so I was kind of hoping I'd get a free replacement. And for the amount they charged me, I really thought I could have done with a free replacement. Woolwich is a part of... There was medical teaching going on, so I've got a tenuous link to talk about famous medical graduates from Edinburgh who have made a name for themselves and are otherwise notable. The first woman to graduate as a doctor from a UK medical school did so from Edinburgh many years before any other woman did, because she changed her name to a male name and pretended to be a man. James Barry was enrolled in Edinburgh University. His voice didn't appear to have broken, but at that stage people would enrol in university when they were 13 or 14, so it didn't really cause any alarm, and did very well, worked very well, and joined the British Army as an army doctor. He was also a skilled surgeon, and in situations where people would have thought any woman would have just fainted, they couldn't possibly cope. He practiced as an army doctor in South Africa and in the West Indies. He performed the first caesarean section in South Africa. The baby was named after him and then went on to become a president of South Africa. The thing that is notable is he once fought a duel with someone who teased him for having a squeaky voice and killed them, and then they stopped teasing him about having a squeaky voice. However, after he died, he was certified dead by a doctor who was a friend of his and probably didn't perform a very thorough examination, as the death certificate just simply said died of cholera, died of typhoid in fact. Then the landlady who was laying out the body discovered that he was in fact female, had been female all along, and a post-mortem established that it was definitely a woman's body who had probably born at least one child. But there was no time in the narrative of his life where it's a fairly well-recorded army career, where there was likely to have been a child born, and if anything, most of his relationships appeared to have been with women, and he did have a number of female friends, and fought duels for them as well. But it probably has been quite well documented because one of the people he wrote to was quite an obsessive person, and when he received a letter, he would write on the outside of the letter the name of the person who he'd received it from and the date. Except when he received a letter from James Barry, because he'd known him since he was a very small child, he would write Miranda Barry on the letter. And there were also documented discussions about what was going on, why the family had decided to educate a daughter as a boy. Other famous women have graduated in medicine from Edinburgh, and also the first woman to actually enrol in the dress as a woman was Sophia Jex Blake, and she spent really difficult to concentrate on her studies, as she spent most of the time having to challenge university authorities for the legal right to actually enrol and study and graduate, but she did eventually, and they were along with 4 other women, and they went on to establish a great many institutions for the treatment of women. One of them established a hospice in George Square, which is now a rather ugly concrete building. Another one established a hospital for women in Edinburgh, which is no longer a hospital, and another one established a Royal Free Hospital. So these 5 women really went on and did an absolute great deal for being the very seed of women in medicine.
Around the same time that these women were fighting for their chance to learn medicine at universities like Edinburgh, they were fighting to be taught by such luminaries as Joseph Bell. Is anyone familiar with the name Joseph Bell? Joseph Bell was a lecturer in medicine at the University of Edinburgh. He was well renowned for his diagnostic skills and his attention to detail, and perhaps more renowned than that for meeting a young Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was his ward at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary in 1877, and used Bell as his inspiration for the character of Sherlock Holmes. Bell was well renowned within the field of medicine and within the fields of forensic science. He was involved in many police investigations, notably the Ard. Bear with me just a second.
You see, some people just actually make up things when we actually do check our facts, but that doesn't mean we're not quite as slick.
I just have to check how to pronounce it. That's it.
Oh, right, that's important.
The Ard Millen investigation. It's also been suggested, anecdotally, and there are some records that perhaps support this, that Joseph Bell, along with Professor Henry Irvine, was involved in investigating the Jack the Ripper murders in London. And it is said that Sir Joseph Bell gave his verdict on who he believed had committed the crimes to the police, and within days of him producing this, the murders had stopped.
There was also some suggestion that in a rather dubious Jack the Ripper conspiracy theory book, that the person who actually did commit the murders was an Edinburgh graduate who was so outraged by the sight of 5 women in the same lecture at him that he developed a grudge against women and went on to murder prostitutes. I think there's absolutely no corroborating evidence for that. But I haven't read the rather dubious conspiracy book, but no one seems to take it very seriously. So we're now heading up to...
Now, some of you may be aware, some of you may not be aware, that one of the most famous British scientists, perhaps ever, Charles Darwin, originally studied medicine in Edinburgh. He was sent here by his father, along with his brother, to study as a physician. Although Darwin didn't really take to studying medicine, he did quite enjoy the student lifestyle. In letters written to his cousin and his family at home, he recounts an evening he spent with his brother inhaling nitrous oxide and much enjoying it. It is suggested in some sources that Darwin was inspired to study zoology and biology by meetings and associations within Edinburgh. In the building we just passed, the old college, in one of the corners, Darwin was taught by the freed slave John Edgemore, or Edgerton, I'm not entirely sure which name he settled on, about taxidermy. And it's also suggested that Salisbury Crags and the theories that were coming up about the formation of rocks and erosion and how they were formed and the process there may have inspired him to consider the origin of the species. Stephen, shall we?
Shall we? Was surprisingly the site of the old infirmary. Either that was a remarkable coincidence or some uncreative street naming. The first infirmary in Edinburgh was established by the Royal College of Physicians mainly to give them people to examine and interesting cases to look at. They had it wasn't actually on this street, it was on a different street. It only had 6 beds, and the woman they employed as a matron was an alcoholic. This closed after about 10 years because it was thought to be inadequate, and a further infirmary, which I believe was here. I'm not sure if this building was actually the building that was the old infirmary.
There is a plaque just up the road.
Yes.
Which is the site of the first volunteers hospital, which became the 6-bed one, which became the Royal Infirmary, which Blackwell's now stands on.
Yeah, which has an excellent medical academic section, so I spent way too much money in. Anyway, this Royal Infirmary did a good job for about 150 years until they built the infirmary on Lauriston Place, which is an excellent building, built in 1848 I believe, and at the start of the NHS in 1948 the superintendent of the hospital wrote a letter saying, with the new NHS this building is really not suitable for purpose anymore, must be replaced urgently, and at typical NHS speed it was replaced in 2003 by an unpleasant and expensive shiny building in Little France, which has actually got far better facilities but does charge you a fortune for parking. But whilst the infirmary was here, there were a number of extremely significant findings made there. There was it was a key part in the discovery of anaesthetics by Sir James Young Simpson, who Kerr is going to tell you about.
Sir James Young Simpson was something of a young Turk in his day. At the age of 28, which is still young today, he was appointed as a chair of midwifery at the University of Edinburgh. He was a free thinker by all accounts. He obviously discovered the anaesthetic properties of chloroform, and he reinvented the forceps to make it more baby-friendly, shall we say.
Well, the original forceps was invented by Huguenot male midwives who were called accouchantes, who were Huguenots, but they had invented a way of getting... Before, if a baby was stuck in the womb and it was died, there was no way of getting it out, so the mother would die as well. So they invented a secret instrument to try and get the baby out, to get the babies out. But this was their trade secret, and they didn't want anyone to find out about it. So they would cover the mother up with a huge cloth to preserve her modesty, do their magical thing and hide it again afterwards. So this was very good for their income, but not particularly good for the advancements of science until Sir James Young Simpson reinvented it. He also tried to invent a vacuum method for extracting babies, which is now used, which didn't work, but actually a version of it called the Ventouse, which is a suction device to extracting babies, is in use today and is far better than forceps. Another thing about Sir James Young Simpson, when he decided he wanted to improve anaesthetics, he went to the University Department of Chemistry, got some various gaseous substances, and his first plan was to just sniff them and see if any of them made him anaesthetise, because he knew ether was a good anaesthetic, but it wasn't ideal. The professor of chemistry said, look, I really think you should maybe give them to an animal first. He said, oh, really, that's a bit stupid, I'm fine, it'll be fine. He said, no, look, if they got 2 rabbits and gave the first gas he found to these rabbits, who then promptly died, and then presumably he did survive, so he did test things himself, but he did used to get his friends to test anaesthetic agents. He used to have people round to his house and just give them a sniff of something, and they'd roll about laughing, and it would work. The days before ethics committees, you could do anything.
I think that shows that James Simpson, he did have quite a wily side. He was a bit of a prankster in some states. There is a tale of a dinner party he held at his house at 52 Queen Street, where he had a wealthy sovereign plantation slave-owning American over, and he sat him next to a freed slave, just to let them have a nice little chat about slavery and ethics and all sorts over some haggis, neeps and tatties.
If you go to the Royal Infirmary today, you will never be allowed to forget that they invented anaesthetics. It's everywhere. However, anaesthetics in ether was invented several years before this, and it was considered impractical because it had a very obnoxious smell. And Sir James Young Simpson invented chloroform, which smelled much better, but did have the small disadvantage that it had a side effect of causing sudden death, and it was difficult to predict what a fatal dose would be. However, he was a hero, he was knighted, and it was used extensively in childbirth, despite the objections of a number of people who I assume were men, who said in the Bible that Eve gave birth to Adam in pain, therefore women should be in pain in childbirth. I was going to make a joke about midwives, but I won't.
I work in midwifery research. So
exactly, I remembered that before I made the joke.
We're here to tell you about one of Edinburgh's most famous geologists, although initially he wasn't famous for his geology. His name was James Hutton. He studied here in the 19th century, and he was quite a raconteur, he was quite rambunctious. He really threw himself into the student lifestyle. He was more commonly found in Edinburgh's bars and hostelries rather than lectures, and this led to a scandal where he got a young lady pregnant. Now, both families involved came to the agreement that Hutton should be exiled to the family farm in the Borders. Here Hutton found a more sedate pace of life, there were fewer pubs and there was more rain. And he developed an interest not in womanising, but in soil erosion. He noticed that the heavy rains that occurred in the Borders almost daily would take the topsoil from his fields and wash it away. But according to the current thinking at the time on how the earth was formed and how it was created by God in the biblical account, there was no room for erosion. There was no room for the explanation of what happened to the soil over time when it just disappeared. And Hutton worked out that if it was not replenished, if the land was not replenished, then it should all be eroded away to nothing within a couple of generations. And so he proposed the first theory of renewal of the earth by a process. His writing is quite impenetrable, so I will perhaps not directly quote from him. By a process of mountains being thrust up from the ocean floor. Now, he didn't have a particularly scientific explanation for this at the time, but it is a fairly accurate depiction of how during earthquakes and during volcanic eruptions new rocks are formed by magma pushing through from the liquid core of the earth. Hutton's discoveries caused a great deal of controversy, though not as much as Darwin's later on evolution, amongst creationists who believed that his theory was going some way to disprove the creation account in the Bible. But nowadays he is held up, despite his frankly terrible writing style, as one of the fathers of modern geology.
But apparently it was never made popular when he was alive because his writing was so bad no one understood it. It was only when he died that one of his friends rewrote it in a way that anyone could read. We're now heading this way.
Unfortunately, we don't really have time to sort of take you up there. It's got some fantastic views of Edinburgh, and it was also a fantastic example of the kind of volcanic rock that is said to have inspired Hutton in his geological thinking, and possibly also Darwin in his evolutionary thinking.
And if you're staying here for a while and you've got time, just wander down to the bottom of the Royal Mile, and it's quite simple to find your way up for a nice view. And I live here and I've not done it yet, which is quite depressing. Okay, we are The next tenuous link I have is we're outside the Royal College of Surgeons. The Royal College of Surgeons and Physicians are the two other great medical institutions in Edinburgh. At this time of year, like everything else in Edinburgh with a roof, they're a fringe venue. But they've got a long history. The Royal College of Surgeons grew out of the Royal College of Barber Surgeons, and that came about when in 1215 Pope, and I forget which Pope, issued an edict that monks should not touch blood. At that time the majority of medical care was provided by monks who would deliver someone's monks would deliver the majority of medical care, and unfortunately, the essential part of medical care at that time was bleeding your patient for no apparent reason, much like is done when we do unnecessary blood tests these days. And once the Pope issued an edict that monks would not touch blood, they had to get somebody else to do the bleeding, which was the barbers, because the barbers had sharp knives and they'd probably lanced a few boils, and this is getting quite freaky, and they became the College of Barber Surgeons. Barber Surgeons was an apprenticeship. You didn't have to be a doctor, you didn't have to pass an exam, you'd be apprenticed to a surgeon, and then at the end of your training you would have to do an operation on a dead body whilst being observed, and you would be a barber surgeon. And for a while surgery was seen as a sort of thick, less prestigious in medicine. In fact, the famous chairs of anatomy at the University of Edinburgh, who did the first dissections and named parts of the skull after themselves, weren't actually surgeons. They were perfectly capable of dissecting a body, but they weren't practicing surgeons, they were practicing physicians, because physicians are snobs. I may be one of them. The Royal College of Physicians formed out of the Royal College of Apothecaries, who were people who provided herbs that were pretty ineffectual, and they saw themselves as being a bit above it. They were all doctors first, they didn't do any of this surgery business, they were just clever people who used their minds. Unfortunately the herbs mostly didn't work, but they didn't let that bother them. And for many years, when a surgeon visited a patient, they had to use a tradesman's entrance. When a physician visited, they had to use the front entrance. They tried merging many years ago in the 18th century, didn't get on at all and promptly demerged, and now we have the separate Royal College of Physicians and Royal College of Surgeons. The Royal College of Surgeons have a very good museum that is definitely worth a look round. It has rather disturbing specimens and the face mask of a body searcher. The Royal College of Physicians is doing a history of medicine walking tour. Fortunately it's after this one, so but they're probably using the same book I am for the inspiration. I think we're done. Thank you very much all for coming along. I hope you found it edifying or vaguely diverting.
We'll be able to take people back towards the general direction of